So welcome back. This is the last session of the day. We had some discussion as to what to do in this last session, and at one point we thought we should talk about the future of corporation tax, then we thought we should talk about the future of corporation tax research. The actual title we've given it is the future of corporation tax research, but actually I've changed the title again. It's the future of business tax research. So the kind of issues of should we be talking about the future of corporation tax or the research. What I'd really like to do in this session is to open up what the Centre for Business Taxation should be doing over the next 50 years and get ideas from all of you. We need ideas. But that's clearly connected with the future of tax. So these two things are integrally connected, I hope. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. We have a fantastic panel of people to help us discuss that. I'm going to start first, but then I'm going to hand over to the panel. The first is going to be Reuven Avi-Yonah, who is the Irwin I. Cohn Professor of Law at the University of Michigan and Director of the Michigan LLM program. He's one of the world's most distinguished academic tax lawyers and has written widely in international and corporate tax. Then we're going to move to Sue Cooper, who's the Group Head of Tax at Schroders. She's a member of many of the important tax committees in the UK and elsewhere, including the tax committees of the CBI, the BBA, and the IMA. Sue began her career at the Inland Revenue as a tax inspector and policy advisor before moving on to the private sector. And then we will have Jim Hines, who is both a professor of law and a professor of economics, and therefore embodies what everybody has been saying today about the need to kind of link economics and law. And that's all inside Jim's head at the moment, the way he manages to do that. I think it's probably fair to say that Jim's background is kind of primarily in economics. So he's indeed one of the most distinguished economists in the world in the field of business taxation. He's made numerous contributions. So I'll hand over to our panel in due course, but I wanted to say a few words first, just to set the scene, if you like, certainly about research, and also to take the advantage of having you all here to just advertise what we've been doing in the centre for the last few years. So I hope you've all got one of these leaflets. In that, we've talked about a number of different things, including some of the research that we've undertaken over the course of the last few years. There have been many, many research projects, and I whittled them down to 10 for the purposes of fitting them into such a small brochure. We did discuss the option of kind of having a 50-page brochure and talking about rather more, but we thought we'd get you to read it rather more. We'd have a bit better chance of you reading if we actually kept it relatively short. So it's quite difficult to choose 10. I'm going to say something about those 10 now, just to kind of give you a flavour for the kind of research which we've done before we talk about the kind of more general issues. But before we do that, so the kind of broad question we want to address is really, what the strapline for the centre says, and it's actually right on the front page there, is what we believe we're doing is promoting effective policies for the taxation of business. So when we think about that, that's a pretty broad aim. It certainly includes other taxes which we might believe are on business, include not just corporation tax, but other taxes as well. And when we typically think about taxes and the design of tax, we think about primarily these things: efficiency, fairness, and administration. So a number of the kind of projects which we have worked on, which we hope we may work on in the future, are to do with each of those. And there are very many specific issues, like when we think about efficiency, that we're thinking about, how does tax affect business behaviour, location to behaviour, or financial behaviour, or investment behaviour, all of those kind of things. All of those, where we think of distortions that are due to tax, that's kind of giving rise to economic inefficiencies and social costs. Fairness, my legal friends sometimes accuse economists of not really thinking enough about fairness in the tax system. I don't think that's quite fair, personally. It's kind of easier to talk about to kind of do research on efficiency than it is to do research on fairness, possibly. And one of the things is, especially when you're talking about corporation tax, to figure out whether we think corporation tax is fair or not, we have to look through the corporation and figure out, which individuals are going to be worse off as a result of the tax. And then we have to kind of figure out whether that's kind of fair relative to all the other taxes and income and wealth and so on. Those are quite hard questions. I'm going to say something about what we've done on that, but I think we're a long way from kind of answering that question. And administration, there are some taxes that are easier to collect than others. Corporation tax is probably at one end of the spectrum of how difficult it is to collect for a number of reasons, many of which we've talked about so far. So there are kind of positive questions of how does tax affect this, how expensive is it to collect, and so on. And then there are normative questions saying, well, how can we design a better tax system? What would a better tax system look like? And I think it's the kind of things that we've done over the last few years have addressed both of those kind of questions. I'm certainly very interested in what the PAN has to say about that for the future, and also what you have to say about that. So let me just, I'm really going to go through these very briefly just to give you a flavour of some of the things that some of the research projects that we've undertaken. So I won't focus on any of those. They're all in our working paper series or in publications if you want to follow any of these. So here's just 10. We thought, this 10 years, 10 research projects seems like a reasonable number to talk about. So I mentioned the first one this morning, the social costs of corporation tax. This is really trying to aggregate all the costs of distortions to corporation that are due to corporation tax in a single number. There's been some recent economic research trying to do that for income taxes, and we kind of borrowed the approach for personal income taxes and applied that to corporation taxes, and came up with what I thought were actually surprisingly large numbers actually for what those social costs are. So as I mentioned this morning, certainly at the upper end of our estimates, for £1.29 of social cost, the government receives £1.29 is wasted. Now that estimate and all other estimates that I'm going to mention have come with a pretty big standard error. I'm not saying it's 29p, but that was our central estimate. So that's quite a large number. If we're thinking about the design of the tax system, we ought to bear that in mind. Okay, second question, who ultimately bears corporation tax? This is trying to address the fairness issue. Economists have been arguing for many years about whether corporation tax is borne by the owners of capital or by labour. We've done some work trying to estimate the extent to which taxes are passed on in higher corporation taxes are passed on in lower wage rates. We found quite a significant effect. This is really hard to do, I think, because it's really hard to kind of find sufficient variation in the data which allows you to kind of estimate that. What we did was actually, I don't think we've kind of fully captured the whole of the effects of corporation tax in the estimates we did. We kind of looking at the effects on wages conditional on a number of other factors within the corporation tax and within the company. But still, we found large effects on labour. Does that mean the system is more or less fair? Well, unfortunately, I don't think we've really said almost anything about that so far, because what we really want to know is corporation tax, or should it be part of a progressive tax system? What we want to know is this borne disproportionately by the well-off rather than the less well-off? Knowing whether it's borne by labour or capital doesn't really get us that far. The labour force could be earning small amounts of money, or it could be earning vast amounts of money. What we haven't done at all, really, and I don't think anybody else has really to any reasonable extent, is to try and ask that, well, try and answer that question. It's easy to ask, but it's more difficult to answer. We've done some work on the competitiveness of the UK. I showed some numbers this morning. This was really in response to the kind of coalition's aims for having a more competitive tax system, but the issues are much more general than that. And we've done work on trying to identify the extent to which countries respond to changes in taxes in other countries, and a variety of work along those lines. Certainly, that work would suggest that the reductions in tax rates in the UK would ultimately lead to reductions in tax rates elsewhere. We've done some work on the effects of the move to I think what Edward called the more territorial system, or somebody called the more territorial system this morning, and what the real effects of that were on the location and size of investment by UK firms. So we've had a number of pieces of work on this. A recent one, for example, has shown that actually, as a result of the change, UK companies now do kind of more investment in lower tax countries than they did. I'm talking about real investment in fixed assets than they had been doing prior to the reform. So these are all kind of positive questions. They're all kind of economic questions, really, in trying to get some empirical evidence to support policy making. Moving on to these, more on the kind of administrative side, we've done surveys of tax inspectors and tax advisors and tax professionals in business of the relationship, how the relationship between business and HMRC is working, and a variety of other aspects of the administration of corporation tax with HMRC, including settlements, for example, and the roles of kind of different agents within both HMRC and business. We've done work, Judith Freeman in particular has done work on the GAR. Judith was working on the GAR many years ago, and the implementation of the GAR in the UK, I think, was to a large extent driven by the kind of academic work that Judith had done prior to that. More recently, we've done a lot of work on BEPS, trying to analyse what's going on with BEPS, trying to see this particular project. It's kind of broad question: will the BEPS project lead to a corporate tax system fit for the 21st century? I guess it would be, we need to take a step back and think what a corporate tax system fit for the 21st century might be. Or we could just say, is it leading anywhere that could be remotely interpreted in that way? I think we were kind of really taking the latter point first. And I think our answer is probably not, unfortunately. But that's a paper which has recently come out. It's been published in Fiscal Studies, if anybody's interested in our research on that. CCCTB, when that was first proposed, or actually before that was kind of formally proposed by the European Commission, we were working on that in the concept of the kind of general model of the European economy. We were trying to figure out, if this was introduced, what would the real effects be on investment, GDP in different countries? Who would be gainers? Who would be losers? And those kind of questions. The results were that some would be, you can kind of guess who would be losers and who would be gainers. The overall effect was, actually rather little change overall in the EU as a whole. And then we have a couple of projects on looking at the financial sector, in particular on bank levies. So bank levies have been introduced in the UK, but also in a number of other European countries. And there's been two reasons why they've been introduced, really. One is to raise revenue, and the other is to try and influence the policies undertaken by banks in an attempt to make them less risky. So we've been analysing, in particular, the latter of those. To what extent have the bank levies actually succeeded in making banks less risky than they were before? And then, again, looking at proposals for financial transactions tax, which has come out of the European Commission again. One of the things we did there was to actually compare the proposals for the financial transactions tax with the actual evidence given by the European Commission in its own impact assessment, which, as far as we could see, didn't actually support the proposals for a financial transactions tax very well. It might have supported other forms of taxation, but it really didn't provide very good support for the financial transactions tax. So that's just, those are just kind of, this was just to kind of give you a flavour for some of the kind of research that we've been doing in the centre. I wondered whether I should go on and make some kind of proposals for where we should be going first, but I thought it might be best to kind of leave that to my panel and see what they had to say first. So at this point, I think I'll hand over to the panel to make some comments, and then we'll open it up for more general discussion. So first up, I'm going to ask Reuven to make some comments.